I get the honor tonight of introducing our keynote speaker. Joe Ferguson recently concluded a 12-year tenure as the Inspector General for the City of Chicago. Under his stewardship, the OIG garnered national prominence for its government audits and inspections, for its creation of a public, user-friendly data visualization platform, and administrative and criminal investigations, including around the Chicago Police Department's actions after the police murder of teenager Laquan McDonald. Prior to being the Inspector General, Mr. Ferguson spent 15 years in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois, was an associate at Sidley Austin, and taught at several law schools, colleges, and in various roles for the U.S. Justice Department. Joe Ferguson is the co-founder and the co-director of Loyola University Chicago Law School's National Security and Civil Rights Program, and a 2022 Pritzker Fellow at the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics. He is a native of Boston and received his BA and honorary Doctor of Laws from Lake Forest College and his JD from Northwestern University. It's very meaningful for me to be introducing Joe Ferguson. I admire his work. It's been an incredible pleasure to be working with him now on issues surrounding our justice system, and particularly police accountability. Joe Ferguson.
I am a recovering Inspector General, which means I am not used to being in a room where the love and the respect for humanity permeates. So I'm really grateful to be here for a reason that I didn't even expect and I did not have in my notes, and that is to be among a group of people who actually walk the walk, and walk the walk, in Sharon's words, in very, very challenging times. So good evening. Humble thanks to Appleseed and the Council for the opportunity to share some thoughts with those physically and in some fashion maybe virtually present. I am a longtime admirer of the work and the intention behind the work of these organizations, all of you, and count myself fortunate on those occasions when I have been collaboratively welcomed to participate in some of that work. So on this, the longest and hottest day of the year, I think the hottest day in a decade, I'm going to try to do something over the next so many minutes I am actually not known for: economy and efficiency of words, which I know is ironic given the core mission of the work of Inspectors General, which I was once for this gloriously messy city. And I also preface my remarks with thanks to a thought partner who is not here this evening, Jamie Calvin, one of the country's great narrative chroniclers of the inequities of what ails us. Our ongoing conversation is something of a catalyst for much of what will follow. And again, apologies, I'm a recovering Inspector General, so I don't mean to bring the harsh to everybody's feel-good mellow, but I gotta do what I gotta do. Vivek Murthy, former U.S. Surgeon General, published a book not long ago entitled Together: Loneliness, Health, and What Happens When We Find Connection. To oversimplify, it's a wonderful book, I strongly encourage it. Murthy identifies the condition of loneliness as being at the root of our national mental health crisis. Hannah Arendt, the great 20th century political philosopher, in her landmark The Origins of Totalitarianism, which sadly has come back into searing relevance today, spoke of the isolation of the individual as the critically necessary condition for the development and the perpetuation of totalitarianism, authoritarianism, which is bubbling up around us. Back to Murthy for a second. Loneliness as a mental health matter is experienced individually in psychological isolation, much like Arendt's observation of the isolated individual in society. Those two things strike me as coming together in a possible diagnosis of a prevailing societal condition today: civic loneliness. This may seem counter-logical in a world drenched in connective mediums like digital communities and social media platforms. Murthy speaks to this, noting that while we are digitally tethered to each other in many ways, it is from a position of individual isolation. We are dots that systems controlled by power elites cluster and segment through algorithmic manipulation that best optimizes their power and their bottom lines. As Camus said in The Rebel, the tyrants conduct monologues above a million solitudes. The more everyday, tangibly observable effects of what I refer to as civic isolation include disaffection and alienation of people from what is supposed to be their government. Indeed, government has become otherized. And this is particularly self-reinforcing once it takes the form of general withdrawal and disengagement from the civic sphere, even to just vote. So how do we as individuals conduct ourselves in a personally responsible way in a world that seems absurd and that prompts us to want to plunge in to at least steady, if not fix it? And if there's anything that I know about all of these people in this room who I do not know, by nature and nurture, that is an impulse I know you all to have. We must approach issues and transactions with a form of witness consciousness that keeps close at hand a bigger picture and the larger objectives. A win is not a win if it only wins the day, if it only wins the media cycle. We have to forge objectives, strategies, and tactics from a perspective that we must conduct ourselves from the perspective of societally sustainable democratic practice. Demonizing an adversary or antagonist, too often the tendency today among authoritarian-sounding leaders. I'm not going to name names. Sharon might have vaguely referenced somebody in that direction, but I'm going to leave that with him. It might win the day, but almost certainly will have collateral consequences with costs that may eventually outweigh the immediate benefits. Now, I know this sounds high-handed, so let me acknowledge or make an admission. This is less a play to morality, but more a call to tactics. The most powerful people in the world today and in our community now reflexively quickly adopt the mantle of grievance. Being aggrieved. The higher road means we must play for the win, but not in a way that leaves the adversary or antagonist with justification to resort to grievance, whether it's as a sword or a shield, which too often it is these days. Now, to land this plane that is floating so many thousands of feet above ground. These currents and tendencies are adversely impacting our efforts to reform policing and improve public safety during a time of mounting crime here in Chicago and in America. The seeming binary of the two, which in fact are not binaries, but symbiotic partners, result in flashpoints of disagreement. The disagreement, usually prompted by one party or another, reflexively casting blame, turns into public conflict. And one party to the conflict too often goes personal. And when they do so, they speak declaratively and with certainty about cause, effect, and culpability, all of which tends to prompt counters that themselves are declarative and speak from certainty, even if couched more professionally. After all, we are all lawyers. Those disagreements and certainties tend to correlate with siloed and calcified thinking and language that the heat of the moment obscures. For example, the prescriptive silos of reform, defund, and abolition respecting policing. It leads those in any one silo to talk often past those in the others, which is neither productive and yields a cacophony that inclines the public that we all endeavor to serve, to turn away, and to tune out. As an aside, I have a different take on those three silos. All three must be in play simultaneously at all times. The way that I see reform, defund, and abolition is reform is what we can do immediately within our grasp. And we must do everything that is within our grasp immediately. And those who get off the train at that point, at this moment, we need to recognize that that is not all the places we need to go because the paradigm itself is faulty. So we must go further than simple reform. Abolition. Yes, it is a program for some. It is an objective for some. I view abolition as necessary in all of this, as the representation of our aspirations in a world that does not require policing at all. That's not going to happen in the United States of America, not in our lifetimes, certainly not in America that has a Second Amendment construed by the Supreme Court under Heller and other rulings, and looks like some more to come, maybe even today. But the aspiration is critically important. And those that are aspiring to that aspiration, they have to be part of the conversation as we reform. They need to push the reformers beyond what is simply immediately available to us. Defund, often talked of as a tactic. I take a slightly different view of defund. Defund is a metric that we all should be examining for how far reform is taking us on the road to the aspiration of abolition. All three need to be in play at once. In all of this, turning back to the prepared remarks, in all of this, Chicago mirrors the rest of the country, which seems in meaningful and debilitating measure paralyzed by competing certainties, which leaves us all that much more demoralized and routinely angered by the sight of what we believe are mostly good people who care to effect positive change, undermining the very prospects of the change they're claiming or actually seeking, claiming to seek or seeking, and in the process poisoning the well from which we must all drink. The result is an atomization of the key players in the criminal justice system itself, in uncomfortable ways, again, mirroring society's atomization of the individual that Murthy spoke of as a mental health matter and that Arendt observed as an objective being achieved by certain power elements. What also gets lost in the crisis, and even in just staid, boring, evidence-based official critiques of an operational component of our law enforcement and criminal justice system, the sort of stuff I did for a long time, is the holistic perspective needed to recognize that fixing any keystone element likely requires collaborative engagement between the leaders of the whole system for the good of all. So let me draw an example of the work from the Chicago Office of Inspector General. More than 2 years ago, OIG issued an evaluation of the Chicago Police Department's record management system. Sexy, right? As was reported, the records are significantly analog, paper, yet to be digitized, uncatalogued, decentralized, housed at the time of the report in locations all over the department, all over the city, with more than 50 separate scatter site custodians. The digital records, dogged by incompleteness resulting from three very simple things: layers of human pass-throughs before inputting of data, a lack of internal audits to check for completeness and accuracy, and the comparative absence of digital fail-safes that would prevent an incomplete report from being uploaded into the system. So we put the report out, and the media, while being helpful to bringing the problem to light, used it as just another cudgel to beat down CPD and its current leadership for a problem that goes back decades. A fair and justified narrative in some respects, but incomplete for purposes of detailing the implication and the fixes. OIG noted that this CPD administrative shortcoming impacted the entire law enforcement and criminal justice system, with significant secondary civil litigation and FOIA implications. At bottom, the system was so substandard, disorganized, and under-resourced that CPD was not positioned to meet its regulatory, legal, and, hold on to this, constitutional obligations. But here's the kicker, and here's where the recovering IG still speaks from the IG place. Every institutional player from leadership down to the front lines in the criminal justice system in Cook County knows all of this from experience. The local and federal court systems, criminal and civil, also possess ample experience-based knowledge that CPD routinely is not positioned to reliably meet constitutional and legal record production obligations. Same for the state's attorney's office, which carries the responsibility of accounting for production of all relevant records, attending prosecutions, and routinely needs continuances or has to dismiss or nollie pros cases because of the gross deficiencies of CPD's record production. Likewise, the criminal defense bar, including to its never-ending frustration, the public defender's office, and the civil rights bar. The same for CPD's Office of Legal Advisor, its FOIA officers, the city's corporation counsel and its law department, and the consent decree monitor. And these are just the lawyers. Add to that, to their great frustration, sworn members of CPD, especially detectives, who can't access all records needed to properly solve crimes, clear cases, and appropriately refer matters for successful prosecution. Every key institutional leader knows in broad strokes the decades-long substandard operation of this keystone to an effective, fair, and constitutional administration of justice. In individual cases, procedural injustices are elided through continuances, dismissals, discovery battles, and in civil lawsuits, settlements, too often with non-disclosure agreements and no admission of liability. But in all of it, granular transactional responses to a systemic problem that leave us with a hovering professional complicity in the problematic state of the whole. That's an uncomfortable truth. This should be a matter for engagement by all institutional leaders of the criminal justice system. They should all share the same objectives, although recent comments, again, I'm going to put this on Sharon, raise questions about whether we all share the same objectives of a system that upholds constitutional values, norms, procedures. But they should all share the same objectives, and indeed, for lawyers, the objectives in many respects take on the dimensions of legal mandate, however much we may differ on culpability and methodology. And it's only through engagement of the shared synergistic connection, Murthy's connection, that we have any hope of achieving the big reforms that are needed. And this describes almost every major issue of this criminal justice and police reform moment. And I want to turn from the automation of leadership, because that is really what's going on here. The way that we are engaging each other at the leadership level results in this atomization of the leaders of all of the components that make the system as a whole and prevent us from talking to each other. And let me tell you, tonight's honoree is a brilliant choice, because by example, deed, and voice, he transcends this and speaks from the place that we should all be sharing in our pursuit of justice reform, in our preservation of constitutional order and standards under a rule of law. But I want to turn from that briefly, from the atomization of leadership in the criminal justice system to the alienation and atomization of people to their government that arises from that same system. 3 years ago, OIG issued a nationally acclaimed report on CPD's so-called gang database that put an administrative scarlet letter on over 130,000 Chicagoans designated as gang-related persons. More than 96% of them people of color. Well more than 50% of them from historically underserved and neglected neighborhoods where it is all but impossible to exist without being in relation to friends, neighbors, or relatives who have actual gang affiliation or history. Indeed, the database designated whole areas in neighborhoods as gang-related. The youngest person at the time of designation in the records we reviewed was 9 years old. The oldest at the time of designation was 75 years old. And people are never removed. Designations extend back decades. The shocking basis of the vast majority of the designations came from so-called admissions in face-to-face encounters in the street with police officers. He said, she said. The errors in the system were shockingly high, reflecting the absence of training of officers in standards and criteria, the absence of supervisory approvals, the absence of data input standards, and the absence of internal audits, and so on. And yet over 500 law enforcement organizations, locally, regionally, and nationally, were afforded access to those designation records. The consequences in the street and in their communal, institutional, economic lives to designated individuals and their families were and are and continue to be devastating, including the children who came into the world long after the designated parent had moved to stable, productive stations in life. CPD has acknowledged without dispute all of those findings and has promised a new system and protocols that would, among other things, permit appeals of designations and sunset designees after a certain time in the absence of new information of gang involvement. 3 years later, no new system, the old system remains. A new system will eventually come, and to be clear, there is, given our gang problems and our unending violent crime challenges, argument to be made for a surgically focused, rigorously maintained, procedurally just gang intelligence database in the pursuit of unquestionably existential law enforcement, criminal justice, and public safety objectives. But how good will it be? None of us has been made privy to those details, repeatedly put off into the future without any meaningful community voice or input. The input of individuals from lived experience living in communities in which government is seen as an alienating and in many instances occupying presence. The insights also apply to civil society legal initiatives. Appleseed's ongoing Brady Lug project is a wonderful example of what it means to convene institutional leaders, to solicit institutional leaders from across the criminal justice system and those who are affected by aspects of the operation of the criminal justice system, to garner perspectives and expertise to address a deficit affecting the criminal justice system and its legitimacy at a holistic level. It's that form of thinking that we need at this time. We, the lawyers in and the leadership of all parts of the legal and criminal justice system, we need to model the behavior that we need from an alienated public who we all need to re-engage. And if it all seems too enormous and impossible, let's take a breath. It is. And it's okay to occasionally flinch, temporarily crouch, and routinely scream privately. But from there, our ultimate civic duty is to engage unsolvable problems. Frederick Douglass had it right. Democracy is a struggle. It is not a destination or an endpoint, but rather an ongoing process that proceeds with certainty only of our ultimate uncertainty. Samuel Beckett offers the totemic charge here. I can't go on. I'll go on. The Council and Appleseed and those of us who draw inspiration and a platform for engagement have a responsibility to acknowledge our uncertainty in what we do, engage the impossible, and check ourselves on the inevitable catalysts of our primal impulses. To quote the late University of Chicago scholar Harry Kelvin, with credit to his son Jamie for sharing this, the challenge is to be against witch hunts in a world with witches. The societal free radicals of this period bend even the most liberal-minded and open-hearted towards witch hunting. However noble and high-minded the motive and intention, the collateral consequences are ultimately atomizing and defeating. Our way through what is a true democracy moment will be found only in connection, community, communication, and collaboration. And the people who we all serve need to see it from their leaders and all of us to begin to believe again. Thank you.